If someone confidently says that in the near future aliens will finally visit us or artificial intelligence will rise against humanity, we probably won't be very surprised because it's already clear that absolutely anything is possible. Russia spent many years assuring the whole world that Ukraine was its younger brother and then started a war. No one in the world expected Ukraine to withstand it, but it has been holding on for 4 years already. And now almost no one is surprised anymore. In the near future, new military confrontations may flare up, the outcomes of which will be difficult to predict, just as it will not be easy to determine who will be an ally, to whom, and who an enemy. The NATO army today is a synonym of military strength, but is it ready, for example, for a full-scale modern war? Is the Ukrainian army now, with the combat experience of a real large war, truly more powerful than any army of a European country, or than all the armies of NATO countries? And if the defense forces of Ukraine have to confront NATO troops, on whose side could the advantage be? Or even more interesting, if the armies of Ukraine and NATO unite, will such an alliance be the most combat-capable military force on the European continent, or even the world? On the other hand, it seems that these questions are completely inappropriate right now, but on the other hand, the world is already living in what was just recently very hard to imagine. Let's try to figure out what advantages the NATO army has, how the Ukrainian army can strengthen it, and what the future of European security might look like. We explain. How is Ukraine moving toward NATO? Ukraine has been moving toward an alliance with NATO for more than 30 years, and Russia is very afraid that this alliance will eventually happen. Ukraine began its first steps toward NATO after regaining independence. In July 1992, the Secretary-General of NATO visited Ukraine, and later the President of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, visited the alliance's headquarters in Brussels. In September 1992, the Embassy of Ukraine was opened in Brussels, which became the connecting link in contacts between Ukraine and NATO. In February 1994, Ukraine was the first among the post-Soviet states to sign an agreement with NATO within the framework of the Partnership for Peace initiative and supported the aspirations of Central and Eastern European countries to join NATO. In 1997, at the NATO summit in Madrid, the Charter on a Distinctive Partnership between NATO and Ukraine was signed. In 2002, a memorandum on Ukraine's support for NATO operations. On June 15, 2004, an article appeared in the revised version of Ukraine's military doctrine about the implementation of Euro-Atlantic integration policy by Ukraine. The ultimate goal was defined as joining NATO. By 2008, Ukraine had prepared an application to receive the Membership Action Plan. But Germany and France opposed it, fearing an escalation of relations with Russia. Then came a rollback, the presidency of Yanukovych, rapprochement with Russia, the revolution of dignity, the Russian occupation of Crimea, and armed aggression in eastern Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine critically needed allies and partners, including NATO, to close Ukraine's sky from Russian missiles. But after an emergency meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels in March 2022, the Secretary-General of the alliance, Stoltenberg, rejected Zelensky's request to close the sky over Ukraine. He said it could lead to a full-scale war between the alliance and Russia. On September 30, 2022, President of Ukraine, Zelensky, Chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, Ruslan Stefanchuk, and Prime Minister of Ukraine, Denis Shmyhal, signed the application for accelerated NATO accession. This meant continuing Ukraine's integration into NATO without applying the previous Membership Action Plan, which is usually one of the mandatory elements. This is already a precedent. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance without previously receiving the Membership Action Plan. On the eve of the 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius and the 2024 summit in Washington, there were rumors that Ukraine might be invited to the alliance, but that didn't happen. At the same time, during just the first 2 years of the war, Ukraine received total assistance of almost $180 billion from NATO countries and other partners of the North Atlantic Alliance. NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte, during a visit to Ukraine in 2024, said, Ukraine is now closer to NATO than ever before, and it will continue on its path until it becomes a member of the alliance. The path is long and difficult, but Ukraine has not changed its aspirations for membership and hopes for the strength of the alliance. What is the strength of NATO? The North Atlantic Alliance, or NATO, was founded in April 1949 with the aim of uniting and creating a system of collective security, primarily for Western Europe, and as a counterbalance to the bloc of Eastern European countries led by the USSR from 1955, the Warsaw Pact countries. After the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, NATO's goals, tasks, and structure changed. At the NATO Prague summit in November 2002, the alliance was reorganized, the structure of NATO force management was changed, and the number of operational and tactical level headquarters was reduced. From that time, the alliance no longer had to defend a specific territory, but to respond to specific tasks and challenges. As of the beginning of 2024, the armies of NATO countries numbered 3.44 million people, of which 2.04 million were in Europe. In such calculations, experts always single out Turkey, which is a member of the alliance, but mostly pursues its own plans regarding military interests rather than supporting common NATO ones. Without the Turkish military, 481,000, the purely European NATO contingent is 1.56 million troops. Analysts note that since 2014, some NATO member countries have significantly strengthened their armies. Due to territorial proximity to Russia, the number of troops has increased in the armies of Eastern European countries, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Latvia, and Estonia. Why is the number of troops not a decisive advantage? Russia entered the full-scale war against Ukraine with an army of almost 2 million people, of which directly 1 million were military personnel. This number was specified in Putin's decree, which came into force on January 1, 2018. According to a new decree starting from December 1, 2024, the official number of personnel in the Russian armed forces must be 2,389,000 people, including 1.5 million military personnel. President Zelensky, in turn, said in January 2025 that the number of the Ukrainian army at the current moment is 880,000 people. International partners help Ukraine with weapons, but to use these weapons effectively, people are needed. Therefore, the defense forces of Ukraine, with fewer troops and often with fewer weapons, have, for the fourth year, not only held back the huge Russian army, but also inflicted significant blows on the aggressor and carried out successful offensive operations. The real combat potential of an army can be defined by how this army has proven itself in combat operations, and also by taking into account what kind of operations these were: peacekeeping, anti-terrorist, limited in scale or full-scale. What were NATO's military missions? In NATO's history, there have been both successful military missions and failures. In total, the alliance has conducted more than 30 different operations and up to 10 separate missions. However, the numbers are still approximate because sometimes this or that operation was conducted by a coalition of countries that included certain NATO members. Let's talk about operations that involved the forces of the largest NATO countries or a significant number of alliance member states. Operation Desert Storm 1991. Desert Storm was a response to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait in 1990. In January 1991, the UN diplomatic mission in Iraq failed, so the multinational anti-Iraq coalition forces launched military action. From NATO countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Canada participated in the operation. They were joined by troops from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Qatar, the UAE, Bangladesh, and Oman. The coalition launched a massive air and missile strike on targets in Iraq. The air attacks and missile strikes continued for almost a month until the beginning of the second phase of the operation, the ground forces offensive. Within 4 days, the territory of Kuwait was liberated from the occupiers. The Iraqi army outnumbered the coalition forces, but was technically weak and by the end of February was essentially crushed. The multinational forces captured 50,000 Iraqi soldiers, destroyed or captured over 3,000 tanks, nearly 2,000 armoured personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, and more than 2,000 artillery pieces. Iraq also lost more than 260 aircraft. The coalition lost up to 1,000 people killed, wounded, captured or missing. Desert Storm is a successful example of the effective use of qualitative technical superiority over numerical advantage of the enemy, as well as the maximum effective concentration of aviation and missiles. Operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina 1992 to 1995 and Kosovo 1999. After the breakup of Yugoslavia, a series of ethnic and religious conflicts flared up in its territory. In the spring of 1992, Serbs laid siege to the Bosnian capital Sarajevo. The UN sent peacekeepers there, and NATO initially dealt only with observation and support of UN forces. In 1995, the large-scale air operation, Deliberate Force, began, a series of air bombings of Bosnian Serbs during the Bosnian War. 400 aircraft and 5,000 personnel from 15 countries were involved. The air mission was intended to force the Serbs to sit down at the negotiating table. NATO forces were opposed by an enemy that was smaller in numbers, technical level, and combat experience, but the alliance's aviation fought in difficult terrain and densely populated areas. Moreover, the Bosnian Serbs' air defense with aircraft and surface-to-air missile systems posed a serious threat to NATO aviation. Deliberate Force is considered a success in NATO, unlike the operation in 1999. Then NATO forces began bombing targets in Serbia and Montenegro in order to force the Yugoslav army to withdraw from Kosovo and to stop the persecution and human rights violations against Albanians living in those territories. Western politicians repeatedly accused Serbia of planning genocide in Kosovo. NATO conducted this operation without a UN mandate. The operation lasted 78 days, after 2,300 airstrikes and more than 3,500 people killed. The president of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, finally made concessions and the war in Kosovo ended. The US and allies' invasion of Iraq 2003 to 2011. The invasion of Iraq was perhaps the largest in terms of the number of ground forces involved. The reason for the start was US statements about Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction and also about the connection of Saddam Hussein's regime with international terrorism, in particular the al-Qaeda movement. A total of 32 countries' military contingents participated in the operation. However, 98% of the invasion army consisted of US and British troops. Data from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or ISS for short, show that the Iraqi armed forces numbered nearly 400,000 troops and 650,000 reservists, 5,000 armoured vehicles, 300 aircraft, and 400 helicopters. The invading forces were significantly inferior to the Iraqi army in manpower and armoured vehicles. The coalition offensive began on March 20, 2003, and by May 1st, the Iraqi armed forces capitulated. The US and its allies acted according to a well-developed strategy: initial air and missile strikes, gaining air superiority, attacks on the enemy's rear to disrupt logistics. The coalition's aviation and armoured vehicles were more modern and advanced than those of the enemy. Operations Enduring Freedom 2001 to 2014, and Resolute Support 2015 to 2021 in Afghanistan. This was almost the only case in NATO's history when all members of the alliance, in one way or another, participated in a military mission. In October 2001, the United States deployed its troops to Afghanistan to remove the Taliban from power. America believed that the Taliban were hiding members of al-Qaeda who were behind the September 11 attacks, in particular Osama bin Laden. Within a few months, US forces drove the Taliban out of almost all of Afghanistan. Bin Laden was not found, but a coalition of more than 40 countries, including all NATO members, remained in the country and formed a security mission, the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF for short. They wanted to help establish a new democratic government and prevent the return of the Taliban. After the elimination of bin Laden in 2011, the operation began to wind down and control over the country was gradually transferred to the Afghan army. In December 2014, NATO officially ended ISAF combat operations in Afghanistan and handed full responsibility for security to the government of Afghanistan. This marked the beginning of another format of involvement in the war in Afghanistan, the Resolute Support Mission. But the Taliban regained strength and began a new offensive. The Afghan army could not resist the enemy, and coalition forces were not ready for a renewed, full-scale war. In 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a peace agreement that stipulated the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan within 14 months, provided that the Taliban adhered to the agreements on combating terrorism. The Americans were withdrawing and the Taliban were capturing provinces behind them. The US Army and NATO campaign in Afghanistan showed both the technical and organizational advantages of the coalition forces do not work in the long-term perspective. The Taliban had neither combat aircraft nor air defense systems, nor a large amount of heavy equipment. They used semi-guerrilla or raid tactics in combat operations. In terms of numbers, the Taliban army and the US NATO contingent were comparable. According to military analysts, at the peak of its strength in 2021, the Taliban force numbered up to 150,000 fighters. What are NATO's advantages and disadvantages for modern warfare? When talking about NATO's readiness for modern warfare, first of all, the alliance's troops have limited experience in conducting large-scale campaigns. Throughout the history of the alliance, there are 3 such operations: Desert Storm, the invasion of Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan. They involved troop contingents numbering from 100,000 soldiers, hundreds, sometimes thousands of combat aircraft, several thousand tanks and armored vehicles and fleets. But in all of these operations, the enemy was either smaller in numbers or technically weaker, and also either had limited combat experience in modern warfare or none at all. NATO's advantage was the ability to concentrate its strike force, aviation, ships, reconnaissance aircraft, logistics, but this concentration takes time. And if the enemy disrupts the preparation, NATO armies will have to act with dispersed forces or build up strength already in the course of warfighting. Because of this, losses will be much greater. US and NATO forces often use blitzkrieg tactics at the initial stage of an operation, which works due to the technical superiority over the enemy. However, if the enemy does not lay down arms after the first strikes but switches to guerrilla warfare or raid tactics, then NATO's technical advantage is practically nullified, as in Afghanistan. The Russian-Ukrainian war has shown that drones have now become one of the most important strike elements. The alliance, in turn, has limited or only theoretical experience in the mass use of drones as a leading strike component. Another aspect is protection from these very drones. NATO troops have no well-developed experience in the use of electronic warfare systems, EW. For their operations, NATO armies did not conduct large-scale mobilization in their countries. The US, the UK and France involved reservists, that is, people who had completed contract service and were assigned to specific units. There was no mobilization of civilians, as in Ukraine, so in this area too, NATO countries lacked experience. Another feature of large-scale NATO operations, the locomotive of missions and the main strike component, were US forces. During the invasion of Iraq in the first active phase of the war, Americans made up to 98% of all deployed forces. That includes personnel and equipment, aircraft, Navy armored vehicles, missile forces. Therefore, the armies of European NATO countries have limited experience in conducting independent large-scale operations in mobilizing military resources, people, equipment, industry. The current White House administration says that Europe must ensure its own security independently. So if NATO is left without the US, it will be a serious challenge for European countries if a war breaks out in Europe. What experience can the Ukrainian army share? Despite some shortcomings, combat experience, the speed of adaptation to new challenges, the implementation of new technologies and tactical methods make the Ukrainian army one of the most advanced in the world, at least from the point of view of the practical applications of weapons, technologies, and human potential. What from its arsenal can the Ukrainian army share with the armies of NATO countries? let's share the thoughts of experts. Experience of mass mobilization. The head of the Come Back Alive Foundation, Taras Shmut, in his interviews gave several messages that clearly illustrate what Ukraine had to face in this context. Taras Shmut, February 2023. A war like the one we are fighting hasn't been fought in Europe since World War II, and in the world, perhaps since Korea or Vietnam. The world is not ready, we are not ready, Russia is not ready. Therefore, a lot is needed every single day. Taras Shmut, July 2023. Our war has shown that a small army, even the most modern one, cannot defeat a less modern but very large army. In October 2024, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexander Litvinenko, reported that since the beginning of the war, more than 1 million people had been conscripted into the defense forces, and that another 160,000 are planned to be mobilized in the next 6 months to reinforce existing units and form new ones. Compared to NATO, Ukraine has not perfect, but indeed practical experience and various algorithms for recruiting troops, volunteers mobilized and through recruitment. Creation of the Unmanned System Forces. Ukraine was the first in the world to create a new separate branch of the military, the Unmanned Systems Forces. They were presented in June 2024 by Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Ivan Havriluk. As of today, Ukrainian forces are using about 70 models of drones for different purposes. Depending on the direction of combat operations, strike drones destroy 70 to 80% of enemy equipment and manpower. Former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Valushny, in April 2025, said that drones have essentially made the battlefield completely transparent. As a result of this absolute transparency in front of the front line, a 10 to 15 kilometer zone of continuous death has formed. It is no longer surprising when a drone hunts not for a group target or an armored object, but even for a single soldier. By the way, this zone is constantly expanding, as does the probability of being destroyed there. Maritime unmanned systems. Ukrainian naval drones are a new and devastating element for the Russians in modern warfare. The spokesperson of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, HUR, Andriy Yusov, said that the HUR and Group 13 have pushed the Russian Black Sea Fleet back to their bases. They are afraid to operate in open waters. Ukraine controls its waters at the level of 90 to 100%, while the enemy goes out only 20 nautical miles and is afraid of being hit even at a distance of 200 to 300 kilometers. He also said that such combat practice and such combat-tested developments are not yet present in the armies and fleets of NATO's European countries. Just the naval drones, Magura, alone destroyed 21 enemy targets, 16 ships, 3 helicopters, and 2 fighter jets. Mass use of electronic warfare systems. Together with the use of drones, the deployment of electronic warfare, EW systems, has reached a new level. Currently, such systems are used by most small air defense systems, mobile air defense groups, and armored vehicles. Trench EW systems are also in use. Again, NATO armies do not have such extensive experience with electronic warfare systems. On certain sections of the front line, EW systems neutralize up to 90% of enemy drones. At the Ukraine United Kingdom Defense Technology Forum in April 2025, Valery Zalushny said that thanks to the development of electronic warfare, we're able to nullify the ability of satellite technologies, radio and GPS-guided munitions to carry out high-precision strikes at the operational level. The effectiveness of expensive missiles and precision shells dropped to zero. What if? At the beginning of our video, we posed several questions that are almost fantastical by today's standard. For example, on whose side would the advantage, i.e., if the Ukrainian army had to confront the armies of NATO? We won't dive into writing a script for an action movie about superheroes. Let's look at the situation from a pragmatic point of view, especially now that we know more about NATO's military strength. Let's consider purely the European NATO armies without the United States and without Turkey, and without the nuclear component. Also, let's imagine that Ukraine is not at war with Russia. Blitzkrieg strategy. In large-scale campaigns, NATO coalition forces usually achieved success due to the blitzkrieg tactic, that is, delivering a powerful first strike against the enemy using aviation and missile components, followed by the advance of ground forces. The main and most powerful logistical component of such a rapid offensive was, for the most part, the US military. If the European NATO armies act independently, they will lack experience and logistical capabilities. Because of this, the concentration of resources and troops may take longer or might only occur partially. The Ukrainian army already has experience in countering enemy force buildup. For this, Ukrainian forces can conduct rapid raids on important targets or localize deep operations to distract attention and stretch enemy forces. Ukraine also has long-range drones that have attacked depots, headquarters, and troop concentrations at distances of up to 1,000 kilometers. NATO forces would have to, so to speak, counter the counteraction. Therefore, the blitzkrieg might not even begin, and both sides would likely get drawn into a kind of ping-pong of raids, airstrikes, and drone attacks, with no real chance to gain superiority. Troop numbers and mobilization potential. The European NATO contingent is just over 1.5 million military personnel, while the Ukrainian army at the beginning of 2025 consists of 880,000 troops. The difference is small, and considering the combat experience of Ukrainian forces, one would say there is certain parity in first echelon forces. But this mathematical equation is a bit more complex. According to Eurostat, the population of the 27 EU countries, most of which are NATO members, was 448 million at the end of 2022. The classic minimum mobilization potential is 2%. That means at least 8.5 million people could potentially join European NATO forces. According to a study by the publication Texty, Ukraine's maximum mobilization resource is 4.8 million people. As we can see, the ratio is not in Ukraine's favor. Aviation. Aviation has always been an advantage in the main strike force of the North Atlantic Alliance in both large-scale and local conflicts. Without the US and Turkey, the European share of multi-role fighter jets amounts to just over 1,300 aircraft. How many aircraft Ukraine currently has can only be estimated approximately, as this information is classified. In November 2023, Zaluzhny said in an interview with The Economist that at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine had only 120 aircraft. Now, thanks to partners, the Ukrainian Air Force has slightly more planes than it had before the war, but it is still about 10 times fewer than the potential opposing side. However, Russia had also nearly 1,500 aircraft at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Nevertheless, Russian invasion operated deep into Ukrainian territory only during the first weeks of the war. Due to the counteraction of various air defense systems, even before the massive supply of them by Western partners, the Russians stopped doing this, limiting their activity to the front line. NATO has superiority in aviation, but if their aircraft try to avoid Ukrainian air defenses, they will operate only along the line of contact between ground forces. Thus, the alliance is unlikely to be able to realize its air power advantage. Weapons to which there is no response. But one thing European NATO armies will definitely be able to take advantage of is weapons that Ukraine has no way to counter. For example, long-range Taurus missiles, Storm, Shadow, Scalp missiles, and they can be produced continuously. The distinctive features of these missiles are air launch capability, high precision, high resistance to air defense systems, and a range of 250 to 500 kilometers or more. With these missiles, NATO could destroy Ukrainian air defense systems, damage airfields and aircraft, command posts, depots, and so on. NATO aviation would dominate the skies and become a threat to ground forces. Heavy equipment and artillery. According to the Analytical Annual Report, The Military Balance of 2024 by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Ukraine had significantly fewer units of heavy equipment and artillery than the European NATO forces. Ukraine, 860 tanks, NATO, 4,900. Ukraine, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, IFVSs, NATO, 7,000. Ukraine, 1,800 artillery systems, Euro NATO 11,000. Ukraine, 750 self-propelled artillery systems, Euro NATO 3,900. Ukraine, 270 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, Euro NATO 1,100. But the Ukrainian army held back the Russian onslaught in 2022 and gradually took out a large portion of enemy equipment using strike drones and counter-battery warfare. The Russian army also suffered heavy losses in heavy equipment at the beginning of the war due to poor tactics, inadequate command, and strategic miscalculations. Some of that armoured equipment was outdated. NATO's heavy equipment is more modern than Russia's or more effective due to modernization. For some time, Ukraine will be able to hold back NATO's armoured vehicles due to its experience and drones. However, in the medium term, the numerical advantage of the other side may still be realised. And this could bring NATO operational and possibly strategic success in a confrontation with the Ukrainian army. Naval confrontation. The fleets of European NATO countries are impressive in numbers. Just the three largest European countries have nearly 230 vessels in their fleets. And here, Ukrainian naval drones are unlikely to have the same effect as they did in confronting the Russian fleet. The presence of NATO aircraft carriers, the modern equipment of destroyers capable of precisely striking enemy targets at long distances, and a different approach to naval tactics give the alliance undeniable superiority at sea. According to the head of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, HUR, Kirill Badanov, up to 70% of naval drones are intercepted by the Russians during attacks. With the more advanced equipment of NATO's navy, this percentage could be significantly higher. Intelligence and reconnaissance. Accurate operational intelligence is perhaps 50% of success on the battlefield. Currently, Ukraine's benefits from NATO's satellite reconnaissance, high-altitude reconnaissance drones and aircraft like AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System. In case of a confrontation with NATO, Ukrainian forces would no longer receive this strategic and operational level intelligence. Ukraine-only reconnaissance capabilities are limited and could be quickly neutralized. This could blind the Ukrainian army, leaving it only with tactical level data, that is, the information gathered by drones directly observing the battlefield. As a result, the Ukrainian side would not know where the enemy is concentrating, how many troops, with what resources. Intelligence and reconnaissance are one of the key elements in modern technological warfare, and the side deprived of or limited in this aspect has little chance of success against a side that uses the full spectrum of intelligence data. Conclusions. So, despite combat experience, army resilience, and mastery of new technologies, it would be very difficult for the Ukrainian army to withstand a hypothetical confrontation with the European NATO armies on its own. But it is very likely that after a relatively short hot phase of several months, both sides would find themselves in a strategic stalemate. Without major losses or a quick gain of significant technological advantage in strike capabilities, neither side would be able to achieve dominance. NATO plus UA equals power. We imagined confrontation. Now let's talk about something better: cooperation. An alliance between the armies of Ukraine and NATO could become an extremely powerful union of two military forces. Even if Ukraine does not become part of the alliance in the near future, active cooperation, exchange of experience, addressing vulnerabilities in each other's forces, and uniting capabilities could give a strong boost to the development of both sides. Most importantly, it would strengthen the entire system of European security. But the prospects of this mutually beneficial cooperation will remain relevant as long as modern-day Russia exists and continues to pose a threat, at minimum to Europe, at maximum to the world. How could European NATO armies and the Ukrainian army complement each other? Infantry. Infantry is the backbone of an army despite the high level of modern weaponry and the prospects of a robotic battlefield. Ukraine can offer NATO invaluable combat experience from modern full-scale war, experience that the Ukrainian infantryman had gained. Ukrainian soldiers say that at the current moment, Ukrainian infantry might be the strongest in Europe. Right now, on the front line, we have unique experience that NATO soldiers haven't lived through. It may seem simple, but there are certain internal tricks, and when Western instructors come to us, they don't fully understand it all. We ourselves can already train the whole world and even offer more knowledge in exchange for Western expertise. In return, the Ukrainian army could receive high-quality training for its sergeants and junior officers under NATO programs. Military personnel themselves note that these programs are effective, advanced, and practical. Another element of cooperation between NATO and Ukrainian armies could be the unification of infantry gear for Ukrainian troops to NATO standards. Protection of armored vehicles. Western armored vehicles, as Ukrainian soldiers themselves said, arrived naked already on site. NATO tanks and armored vehicles were equipped with reactive armor, and specialized protective screens were developed to shield them from drones. Western military experts noted that such protective elements for equipment significantly increase its survivability on the battlefield. Under the conditions of FPV and kamikaze drone dominance in the air, Ukraine is trying to protect all heavy equipment with electronic warfare (EW) stations. NATO armies can significantly enhance their potential if they modernize their equipment in this direction. Ukrainian military personnel have noted that NATO training programs are highly effective. Therefore, training Ukrainian tank crews, IFV, APC operators, artillery personnel and other specialists under these programs increases the defense capability of the Ukrainian army overall and of each unit individually. Currently, the armored vehicle fleet of Ukraine's defense forces is referred to as a zoo, since the West supplies equipment based on the principle, we give what we have. Of course, this help is very necessary and Ukraine doesn't get to choose. Nonetheless, in the future, there is a need for unification of armaments. This applies to tanks, IFVs, APCs, self-propelled artillery, artillery systems, and MLRS. This would simplify equipment operation, maintenance, and, most importantly, increase combat effectiveness and potential interoperability with NATO forces. Because if, hypothetically, tomorrow on the Ukrainian-Russian border, a Ukrainian and a German MLRS battery are positioned side by side and one of them runs out of launch rockets, the other unit won't be able to help restock ammunition. Kropiva. The fire control system Kropiva, stinging nettles in Ukrainian, developed at the beginning of the full-scale war, is a cartographic reconnaissance program. It runs on Android and allows, via a terminal or tablet, for easy identification of enemy positions. The program transmits data to neighboring artillery units and allows coordination of their fire. According to expert analysis, Kropiva is more advanced than American and NATO counterparts. It was improved as the structure of the war evolved. The development and integration of such a program into NATO's shared systems would significantly deepen battlefield coordination. European Unmanned Systems Forces. The creation of unmanned systems forces in Ukraine has become one of the largest innovations in military history. Russia has already copied this idea and is creating similar troops. NATO armies still do not have such a separate branch of the military, although there too production of various types of UAVs and corresponding units is being scaled up. Ukraine can offer its accumulated experience in the use of various types of unmanned systems, experience in forming units and branches, and successful experience in knowledge transfer. It is possible that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces could become the basis of prototype or one of the components, for example, of a European unmanned systems force or a similar force within NATO. After all, it is Ukraine's USF that, for now, are the only ones in the civilized world with actual experience of modern war and, to a large extent, become a product of this war. This also applies to naval drones, which are already demonstrating at sea the warfare of the future, where relatively inexpensive unmanned devices destroy costly conventional naval combat vessels. Future European security lies in cooperation. At the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, the alliance approved a new 10-year strategic concept. Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine has shattered peace and seriously changed the conditions of our security. Given that Russia has begun to pursue an even more aggressive policy towards the countries surrounding it, the future of European security lies in comprehensive cooperation between Ukraine and the European NATO member states. According to a report by Germany's Federal Intelligence Service and the Bundeswehr, from March 2025, after the war in Ukraine ends, Russia could be ready in terms of resources for a war against individual NATO countries within just 5 years. So, NATO and Ukraine must cooperate. And to grasp what kind of success such cooperation could bring, let's allow ourselves, just for a moment, to dive into an action movie scenario. Imagine the year is 2030. Russia begins an act of aggression against one or more European NATO countries. Perhaps it resembles Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, a quick occupation, ultimatum to neighbours, a triumphant frenzy over the return of primordially Russian lands. But this time, the international community's reaction is not like it was to Russia's aggression in 2014 or 2022, and Ukraine is already a fully fledged part of that community. The European forces of the alliance, together with the Ukrainian army, prepare a counterstrike. Let's call this Operation Storm in the Swamps. The theatre of war is nearby, so preparation takes just a few weeks. Of course, Russia tries to interfere. Unidentified drones attack NATO and Ukrainian troop concentrations nightly. There are acts of sabotage on railroads, bridges, power plants. Russia, as usual, denies involvement. Mobile air defense groups, created based on Ukrainian experience and equipped with modern weapons and target detection systems, intercept enemy drones. Coordination among these groups happens through a joint intelligence sharing system. NATO and Ukraine mislead the enemy about the direction of a possible strike, just like Ukraine did in 2022 when the enemy expected an offensive toward Kherson when the real blow came in the Kharkiv region. Russia spreads its forces to cover all possible attack sectors. In the direction the enemy expects, an airstrike occurs. The Russians think they're ready and hope to repel the offensive. Ukraine and NATO give Russian troops time to begin building defenses along the fake direction. Then, the coalition of Ukrainian and NATO forces launches a massive air missile drone strike on Russian troops in an entirely different sector. Storm Shadow, Scalp, Taurus missiles destroy command posts, radar stations, air defense systems, warehouses and airfields 200 to 500 kilometers deep into Russian defenses. Ukrainian NATO drones deliver a massive strike up to 30 to 50 kilometers in depth, supported by MLRS and tube artillery. Russia scrambles dozens of strike aircraft, but their airfields are under attack, so they operate uncoordinated. NATO aviation and air defense quickly detect and destroy them. Then comes the ground assault. At the spearhead of the attack, the 1st and 2nd Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard, formed from the Azov and Khartia brigades, as well as NATO's airborne assault brigades. The offensive is supported by over 1,000 tanks and armoured vehicles. Russian generals pull in reserves and, most importantly, redirect troops from the fake sector of the offensive. As a result, long convoys of Russian troops fall under attack by Ukrainian strike drones operating via NATO reconnaissance and communication systems. Russia also tries to respond with drones. However, NATO aviation shifts its strikes deeper and deeper into Russian territory, destroying drone depots, launch sites, and logistical vehicles. Electronic warfare units jam enemy UAVs. Russia is forced to bring part of its fleet out to launch a massive missile strike on NATO and Ukrainian rear positions and command centres. Ships fire missiles, but NATO air defence shoots down up to 90% of them. This is made possible by the successful experience of Ukrainian air defences in repelling Russian missile attacks. At the same time, NATO destroyers launch powerful missile strikes on Russian ships, supported by aviation and Ukrainian naval drones. This attack destroys 60% of the Russian fleet. The rest attempt to retreat to their bases. On their way, they are struck by Ukrainian naval drones, and the ships that survived the first strike are also disabled. On land, the alliance brings in reserves, increases the strength and depth of its strike. The European territory occupied by Russia is liberated, and the occupying troops find themselves surrounded within 2 weeks. Coalition forces advance, and the Russian army fails to form new defensive lines, crumbling under numerical and technological superiority. Russia plays its last card, threatening to use nuclear weapons. Initial attempts at negotiations fail as Moscow, as always, lives in a parallel reality and makes absurd demands. The UN Security Council convenes and adopts a resolution calling for a ceasefire. But some European states also possess nuclear weapons. They threaten conventional strikes deep inside the Russian Federation. Negotiations resume. Moscow makes concessions. The parties agree to halt combat. Ukrainian and NATO troops receive the relevant order. The commander of the 1st Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard, Colonel Prokopenko, call sign Redis, receives this information just as he's looking through binoculars at the towers of the Kremlin.